I froze when my wife's lover arrived and she ran to embrace him at the company couple's party, as if I weren't there, as if everything we'd experienced was nothing. The room spun for a second, but I maintained my composure and left the room without looking back. "Now you can dance with him guilt-free," I whispered before leaving. And that night, something inside me died silently, as if a door had been locked from the inside and the key thrown away forever. I left silently, without making a scene, without a fuss, without tears. But inside my chest, an implosion was happening in slow motion. The sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the ambient music, everything faded to a dull noise as I walked away. No one noticed. No one cared. She didn't follow me. And in that exact moment, I knew, this was the end of our story. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the ease with which she'd given up what she'd always sworn to protect. I was the safe plan, the stable life, the sure love. But she chose the adrenaline of something new, and threw away everything we had built, like someone throwing an old piece of paper in the trash, without even reading what was written. In the days that followed, I waited for a gesture. A genuine repentance. An apology without apology. But all I saw was silence and absence. Until finally, it came. Too late, of course. He had already vanished, like a shadow that only exists while the illusion lasts. She had never wanted anything beyond the moment. And she, finally alone, faced her own choice in the mirror, and the reflection was no longer the same. Her gaze, once full of certainty, now trembled. Her words came out broken. And the pride she had so flaunted had dissolved into silent sorrow. I remember exactly the moment I slammed the door behind me for the last time. She stood there, in the doorway, dressed in doubt, regret, and longing. But I was no longer the man she knew. I had walked through the rubble of our love and, in the process, rebuilt myself in silence. And when she asked to talk, I listened respectfully. Not for her. But for myself. Because those who forgive don't forget. They only learn to move on. And that's what I did. I forgave because I didn't want to carry a grudge. I forgave because forgiveness freed me more than revenge. But I made it clear, what we were no longer exists. The love she killed with her choice, no one can bring back. There was a time when she was everything. My priority. My home. The future I saw when I closed my eyes. And suddenly, she was just a familiar face with distant eyes. The kind of distance no hug can bridge. And seeing her alone, dealing with the consequences of her own destruction, I understood that sometimes justice doesn't come in a scream. It comes in silence. In the void. In the echo of what can no longer be fixed. She wanted to return to square one, but that square one no longer existed. Everything changed the minute she decided to run into another man's arms, in front of everyone, while I was still holding her glass of wine. Over time, I found another love. Different, serene, pure. No games, no doubts, no half-measures. A calm love, made of peace, sharing, and loyalty. A love that didn't come to fill a hole, but to rebuild a road. And it was with this new woman that I learned that true love doesn't shout. It cares. It doesn't hurt. It embraces. It doesn't lie. It chooses every day, even when it's difficult. And there, in that new chapter of my life, I discovered how much I deserved to be loved fully, not just tolerated. But fate, with its subtle irony, decided that she would see it all happen. That she would watch life go on without her. That she would feel the pain of being forgotten by someone who, for so long, had only known how to remember. And the cruelest thing was that she sought me out again. With eyes full of the past and promises, with a trembling voice, saying that she loved me, that she had made a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing. That now she understood everything. But time had already passed through me with such force that it left marks impossible to erase. She looked for me the day she found out I was getting married. She came to my place, knocked on the door as if she were still a part of my life. You said you needed to see me. That you needed to tell me one last thing. That you were willing to do anything. That you had regretted it the moment you saw me leave that party. But I looked at her calmly, with the maturity of someone who has cried enough, and said, with the serenity of someone who no longer harbors anger, you taught me what it means to be strong. Because it was after your choice that I discovered how much I deserve someone who chooses me too. And she, with red eyes, still insisted, saying she would wait for me. That I would accept being my friend, my support, anything, just to be near. But it was too late. The pain I once felt was no longer mine. I had scars, yes, but now they were medals of overcoming, not open wounds. When she saw me at the altar with another woman, she didn't run away. She stayed. From afar. Silently. And she cried. She cried not out of anger, nor jealousy. She cried because, for the first time, she understood the gravity of her own choice. She cried because she realized she'd destroyed the love of her life for something that didn't even last. And that embrace she'd given another man, which had seemed so full of passion, was now just a bitter memory of a moment that cost her dearly. While I sealed a new beginning, she faced, alone, the definitive end of what could once have been eternal. The funny thing is that many people think betrayal ends in scandal, in a fight, in revenge. But what hurts most is what comes after. The silence. The indifference. Life goes on without you. The other person rebuilding themselves in peace, while you hold the pieces of something that can no longer be put back together. And when she saw me smiling again, truly loved, she understood that that look that had once been hers alone now belonged to someone else. And that the touch, the hug, the complicity, all of this was now part of a new story she wasn't a part of. But what no one saw, what no one knew, is that until that day, I still carried a doubt. Not about her. Nor about myself. But about what would have happened if she hadn't run into the arms of another. If she had stayed. Chosen. Stayed. Because true love is never perfect, but it is a constant choice. And she chose differently. Maybe on impulse. Maybe out of ego. But she chose. And choices have consequences. Today, I move forward with ease. But not without memories. Pain has taught me much more than love ever could. And if one day she asks me if I was happy after all this, I will say sincerely, I was happy, yes, but only after she let me go. What she didn't know, was that her lover never stayed. That he disappeared the same way he appeared, quickly, smiling, lying. That she, in fact, never had another love, only a moment. And that what she lost, was forever. But there's one detail she never discovered. A secret buried between the moment of betrayal and their final reunion, something that would explain why, even after everything, I never looked at her with hatred. Something that could completely change how she, and whoever hears this story, understands what really happened, and why. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. The stories told are fictional, but reflect the real consequences that thoughtless choices can cause. Our goal is clear: show how betrayal destroys not only relationships, but entire lives. Now take a deep breath, put on your headphones and prepare your heart. Because what you're going to hear is a shocking story, intense, painful and unforgettable. His name was Daniel. He was a man with a calm presence, a measured voice, and an eye for detail. He was never one to dominate a room with his voice, but when he walked into a room, even unintentionally, he drew attention with the way he carried himself, a kind of assurance that went without saying. He was 37 years old, had a good job in the strategic planning department of a multinational company, and had built his life step by step, like someone who knew exactly where he was going. He wasn't a millionaire, but he always knew how to balance dreams and responsibilities. His life wasn't perfect, but there was order, rhythm, and a deep sense of loyalty to his choices. And of all the choices he'd made, none seemed as right as marrying Helena. Helena was 34 years old and the exact opposite of Daniel in many ways. Where he was introspective, she was extroverted. Where he pondered, she took risks. And perhaps it was precisely this difference that initially attracted them. He was captivated by her light-heartedness, the way she made friends easily, the way she laughed out loud in public without any shame. She, in turn, saw him as an anchor. Someone who brought her back when everything around her seemed to be spinning too fast. They had been together for 9 years, married for 7, and their relationship was, at least to outsiders, solid and respectful. They weren't the most passionate couple in the room, but they had a bond. That kind of connection built over time, where one knows what the other will say before the sentence is finished. They made plans together, laughed at the same movies, knew each other's quirks without criticizing. Helena hated that Daniel left his towel on the bed, he found it unbearable how she lost everything in her own bag. But those were details. At the end of the day, they knew exactly where they stood. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony, books scattered throughout the house, and a 2000s playlist that played almost every morning in the cafe. Helena loved cooking on Sundays while Daniel poured wine and talked about seemingly trivial things, like the bathroom renovation they wanted to do or whether the upstairs neighbor had changed boyfriends again. In her eyes, he was predictable. And that, in a way, was comforting. A kind of love that didn't require major daily proof, but showed itself in small gestures, like when he'd stop by the grocery store to buy her favorite wine without her asking, or when he'd remember dates she'd always forgotten. Helena worked in digital marketing, a more dynamic, more connected, more hectic field. She spent a lot of time between online meetings, presentations, and social media. She enjoyed the freedom her profession afforded, and recently, she had been receiving praise for a project that finally seemed to put her in the spotlight. Daniel was always supportive. He never belittled her projects, even when they were still small. He always believed that one person's success should be the other's happiness. And that was why he never complained when she arrived late or when she had to work late from home. He trusted her. He trusted her with an almost naive faith, like someone who believes that love, when true, is enough to shield two people from any storm. The couple's friends were a curious blend of both worlds. The quieter ones, from Daniel's circle, balanced the chaotic energy of Helena's colleagues, who were always more spontaneous. They were light-hearted get-togethers, laughs at impromptu dinners, and short trips during the holidays. Neither of them had children, and while this was a topic that came up occasionally, it was never the center of conversation. Both said they wanted to one day, but preferred to wait for the right moment, greater financial security, more stability, perhaps a new home. The truth is, they were comfortable with their lives. But comfort is sometimes treacherous. And it can silently become the beginning of an invisible erosion. Nothing screams. Nothing crumbles. It just gives way, inch by inch. And maybe that's what started to happen. Conversations didn't last as long anymore. Sunday dinners turned into takeout orders. Shared laughter gave way to long silences. Nothing abrupt. Just subtle changes, which one or the other chose to ignore. Daniel told himself it was a phase. That it was fatigue, routine, overwork. And Helena said it was normal, that every relationship has its ups and downs, and that they were fine. She always repeated this, "We're fine." As if saying it were enough to make it true. But there had been something different about her in recent months. A distant look in her eyes, a fragile attention, as if her mind was always elsewhere. Daniel noticed. He tried to make conversation, asked questions, prepared little treats. But there was an invisible barrier between them. A glass wall. He saw her, she saw him, but they no longer connected with the same depth. And that made him uneasy. Not to the point of suspicion, because there was still that familiar aura about her. But something inside him was beginning to bother him with the fact that she no longer shared everything as before. The stories from work came more filtered, the details of her days seemed summarized. It was as if she chose what to say, and what to hide. Their wedding anniversary was approaching, and Daniel wanted to plan something different. He booked a weekend at a charming inn near the mountains. Helena thanked him with a gentle smile, but her enthusiasm seemed more formal than genuine. They went anyway. And the trip was good. In the most neutral sense of the word. No arguments, no euphoria, just togetherness. But in Daniel's eyes, it was a warning. It was as if he were trying to hold in his hands a love that was already slowly slipping through his fingers, and he didn't have the strength to hold on. Still, he tried. Because for him, love was a construction sustained by daily effort. And he was willing to do his part. He always had been. Their return from the trip coincided with a corporate event at the company where they both worked. A get-together between teams from different departments, with space for spouses. The atmosphere was relaxed, without ties, with soft lights, background music, and glasses of wine circulating. Helena seemed more at ease there than she had all weekend. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He simply observed. She smiled, chatted animatedly with people he barely knew, and at one point, he lost track of her among the groups. He didn't worry. He simply continued exploring the room, chatting with acquaintances, hoping to see her again. It was at that moment that everything began to move, slowly, toward what would come next. But there was still no pain. Just the construction of a scenario. Of a moment. Of a story that had yet to reveal its turning point. Because sometimes, life moves slowly toward the breaking point. And when it arrives, everything changes. But for now, in that room, there was just a man watching his wife smile at other people. There was a heart that still believed. And there was also a subtle absence. That feeling that something important was slipping away, even for no apparent reason. Daniel, in that moment, still loved her. And that was all he knew. In the days following the corporate event, Daniel noticed something had changed, subtly yet definitively. Helena seemed lighter, more energetic, almost radiant at times. She spent more time on her phone, smiled at unsolicited messages, and went out more often under the guise of after-hours meetings or coffee with teammates. He observed everything with his usual calm, but within him, an anguish began to grow that he could no longer hide from himself. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the new project, maybe it was the professional excitement that was finally beginning to yield results. He didn't want to be that suspicious, controlling, jealous type of man. It wasn't his style, never had been. But something inside him, an instinct stifled by years of trust, began to stir silently. It was like a string stretched too thin, about to snap. One night, as Helena slept soundly beside him, he found himself staring at her as if trying to decipher a story without knowing the words. Her face was serene, her hair spread across the pillow, her breathing even. She seemed so familiar and yet so distant. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. There was still no concrete reason, no proof, no facts to substantiate the growing unease. Only a feeling that she was no longer entirely his. Not in body, but in soul. It was as if something inside her had turned its back, and he was merely a convenient presence in the scene. Their routine continued with a strange normality. Saturday lunches, shared shopping lists, and even moments of forced affection, as if they were both trying to preserve something they knew was slipping through their fingers. One rainy Sunday, while she was preparing risotto and discussing a new strategy for an important client, Daniel interrupted her and asked if she was happy. The question came dry, direct, without warning. Helena paused for a second, looked at him, and smiled. She said yes, that she was just tired, but happy. And she went back to stirring the pan as if nothing had happened. He nodded, smiled back, but deep down, he felt the weight of an answer that didn't say it all. The following week, Daniel arrived home early to find the apartment empty. She'd sent a message saying she had a meeting at another company location. Nothing out of the ordinary. But he noticed the bed was strangely unmade, as if someone had lain there for a few minutes. Her pillow was marked, and there was a faint fragrance in the air he didn't recognize. It wasn't her usual perfume, it was something different, more striking. He looked around, trying to figure out if he was being paranoid. If he was projecting his insecurity onto trivial things. But his senses were heightened, and his heart was restless. Over the next few days, he began to observe more. He wrote down schedules, memorized gestures, and began to notice patterns. Helena always placed her phone face down. Her laughter as she texted was restrained but constant. When he asked who she was talking to, she responded casually, saying it was the team, inside jokes, or an old friend. Daniel knew she was sociable. But something in her demeanor was different now. It wasn't lightheartedness. It was carefulness. A care you don't have when you have nothing to hide. One day, he decided to invite her to a surprise dinner. He called late in the afternoon and asked her to meet him at a restaurant she liked. Helena hesitated, saying she had a lot of work to do and might not be able to get out. He gently insisted, and she finally accepted. She arrived almost an hour late, bringing with her a tense smile, a cold hug, and a gaze that avoided his. Dinner was quiet but empty. They talked about trivialities, and she never once asked why he had called her out of the blue. Daniel could tell that any gesture of approach now made her uncomfortable, as if his presence were a reminder of something she wanted to avoid. He paid the bill, walked her to her car, and in the silence of the drive back, gazed out the window as she drove. It was like being next to a stranger who wore the same perfume as the woman he loved. The following weeks were filled with a silence neither of them dared to name. The days were filled with commitments, the weekends became brief spaces of almost formal coexistence. Daniel, who had previously sought answers, now simply withdrew. He didn't want to confront. He wanted to understand. His heart still believed there was something to be saved, that it was all the result of a bad phase, of fatigue, of a temporary distance. But his eyes were beginning to see what his heart was trying to protect. And he began to silently accept that there was something there that could no longer be ignored. Then came the invitation to a new company party, an annual event where couples were welcome. Daniel hesitated, considered not going. But Helena insisted. She said it would be nice, that they needed a light evening, that it was just a get-together. He relented. He thought maybe it was her attempt at reconnecting. Or a way to show that there was still something between them. He dressed carefully, as did she. They took a taxi together, and during the ride, they talked about the song playing on the radio. They laughed together. For a moment, everything seemed the same. Daniel, for a moment, believed that this night could be the fresh start he'd been waiting for. They arrived at the dining room and were greeted with hugs, greetings, and smiles. The atmosphere was light and relaxed. People chatted in groups, waiters passed by with trays, and the lights were soft. Helena seemed at ease. She greeted everyone naturally and, in a short time, had integrated herself into a group of colleagues Daniel didn't know. He, more reserved, grabbed a glass of wine and stepped back, watching from afar. It was beautiful to see her laughing, moving so easily. But it was also painful to realize that, in that setting, he felt like an outsider. And it was precisely at that moment, as he was trying to find his place among those people, that it happened. From the middle of the room, a man he'd never seen before emerged. Tall, relaxed, with a confident gaze. The kind of person who always seems comfortable wherever he is. Helena saw him, and within seconds, something changed in her face. A mixture of surprise, suppressed emotion, and desire. Daniel froze. Time seemed to slow down as she crossed the room and, without hesitation, hugged him tightly, intimately, with an intensity he'd never seen in months. No words were spoken. No explanation. Just that gesture. A long, intimate, achingly natural embrace. As if he weren't there. As if everything they'd experienced had evaporated. Daniel maintained his composure. He bit his lip, took a deep breath, and walked calmly to the door. He passed through slowly, without looking back. His chest burned. But his face didn't show it. And when he was outside, out of sight, he murmured a single phrase, like a whisper to the wind, "Now you can dance with him without guilt." And he left. Without making a sound. Without announcing the end. But with his heart bleeding. He knew that in that room, a story had been buried alive. What he didn't yet know, was that Helena's gesture that night carried more than betrayal. There was something behind that embrace. Something that was still hidden. And that, when it came to light, would change everything. Daniel spent the following days immersed in an internal silence that felt more like mourning. He avoided talking about what he felt, avoided mentioning what he saw. He simply allowed time to push him from one day to the next, like a spectator of his own life. Helena tried to contact him a few times, timidly, cautiously, as if testing the waters. First, there were generic messages asking if he was okay, then an unanswered call, and finally, an audio message, where her voice trembled slightly, saying she needed to talk. Daniel listened but didn't respond. Not out of contempt. But because he was still trying to gather the strength to understand how someone who slept next to him, who claimed to love him, could run into the arms of another man in front of everyone, without hesitation, as if everything they shared was a dispensable detail of a life she had already decided to abandon. He didn't tell anyone. Not his friends, not his family. He held it in with a mixture of shame and sadness. "I knew I would be questioned, judged, perhaps even comforted, but I didn't want to share the pain. It was too intimate. It was too dirty." And perhaps, deep down, he was still waiting for some explanation that made sense, something that would spare him the humiliation of being the last to know, the last to realize, the last to understand. Until, one night, she appeared. Without warning, he simply rang the doorbell with a trembling hand. Daniel opened the door, surprised by her presence there, so exposed, so vulnerable. Helena asked to come in. He hesitated, but made way. They sat facing each other, like two strangers trying to remember who they were before everything fell apart. She began by saying that what happened at the party wasn't what he imagined, that it hadn't been planned, that she was confused, that she didn't know how it had gotten that way. Her words slipped between empty excuses and attempts at rationalization, but Daniel said nothing. He just watched. Until, exhausted with herself, she admitted that she had been involved with that man for months. That it had started as an unpretentious exchange of messages, a conversation about work, an informal lunch that had turned into increasingly frequent meetings. She said she was missing something, that she thought she was just distracting herself, and that she hadn't expected it to become an avalanche. Daniel narrowed his eyes for a moment, as if it was still difficult to process, even after everything. He asked if she loved him. Helena hesitated. He said he thought so, but now he wasn't sure of anything. That man, the other one, had disappeared. That he no longer responded, that he couldn't explain, that he had simply vanished overnight. And that was when she began to cry. Not a loud, desperate cry, but a contained, almost childish sob, like someone who understands too late what they have lost. Daniel waited for her to calm down. And when he saw her calmer, he asked something he hadn't had the strength to ask until that moment: why? Helena raised her eyes, still moist, and tried to say she felt invisible, that she thought he no longer desired her, that routine had killed something between them. He calmly interrupted her. He said that all relationships go through phases, that no one loves with the same brilliance every day, but that love is in choices, and that she chose to leave. Helena then tried to hold his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't reciprocate. And in that icy gesture, she understood the depth of the wound. What she didn't know, however, was that Daniel had already discovered something else. Something she hadn't even imagined he knew. A few days earlier, after the party incident, he had decided to seek answers. He scoured social media, rummaged through his memories, and in a stroke of luck, or fate, he found the profile of the man she was cheating on him with. And there, among the photos and comments, he discovered something Helena had never dared to share. The man wasn't single. Much less free. He was engaged. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks later. His fiancée was a seemingly sweet woman, with whom he posed in travel photos, family lunches, and long texts about how much she had changed his life. The same life he shared, in parallel, with Helena. Daniel didn't tell her right away. But that night, face to face, seeing her there, so fragile, so lost, he decided to tell her. He got up, went to his desk drawer, and pulled out a printed sheet, a screenshot of a recent post of the man at a restaurant with his fiancée, showing off his ring and thanking her for her love. He handed the sheet to Helena. She took it, confused, and read it. Her eyes slowly widened. And then her world collapsed. The tears came harder, now accompanied by denial, by broken sentences, by a despair she couldn't contain. She tried to say she didn't know. That he said he was separated. That he had promised to end things. That she believed him. Daniel looked at her silently. For the first time, she felt pity. Not anger. Not revenge. Just pity. Because now she was standing before someone who had traded everything for a man she never intended to stay with. Helena got up from her chair, paced in circles, brought her hands to her face, and spoke in a choked voice that he was right, that she was an idiot, that she was blind, that she thought she was experiencing something real. She said she felt used, discarded. She said all she wanted was to go back. That now she understood how much Daniel loved her, how patient he was, how much she had destroyed the only true love she had ever had. Daniel listened to her with a mixture of pain and lucidity. Her every word sounded like an attempt to hold on to something that no longer existed. That love had died. Not from lack of feeling, but from exhaustion. He had tried, until the very last moment. But now it was too late. Helena approached him. She tried to touch him again. She said she still loved him, that she would do anything to rebuild. He took a step back. He said he could no longer trust her. That it wasn't just the physical betrayal, but the breaking of everything they represented. He said that betrayal begins long before the touch, that it stems from omission, from lies, from a lack of presence. And that she had been absent long before she actually left. She cried, begged, pleaded. She said the other man was a coward, that he no longer listened, that he had disappeared, that now she was alone. Daniel replied, with the calm that only mature grief allows, that she wasn't alone by chance. She was alone because she chose to be. That every choice has a price, and that life exacts its toll without warning. He said he held no hatred, that he wished she could find herself again, but that he had decided to move on. And that there was no longer room for her on his new path. Helena fell onto the couch, exhausted, as if everything inside her had been ripped away. She said she had no one. That she didn't know where to go. Daniel approached, put his hand on her shoulder, and said, "You still have yourself. Start over. Learn. Because some mistakes are costly, and this was one of them." That night, she left, her face flushed with regret. She carried in her hands the sheet of paper bearing the face of the man for whom she had destroyed her home. And she carried in her heart the weight of the loss that was now final. Daniel, for his part, sat at the table and took a deep breath. He felt no relief. He felt a profound emptiness, but also the certainty that he had done what needed to be done. That now, he was the one free. What he didn't imagine was that days later, walking with a new person by his side, he would run into Helena across the street. And what happened in that brief reunion would forever change everything that remained. A few weeks had passed since Daniel and Helena's last conversation. The definitive encounter, where everything was said, where no question went unanswered, seemed to have left scars on both of them. Each followed their own path, even if the pace and direction of those paths had completely different meanings. Daniel, silently, began to rebuild his life with firm, if internal, steps. He no longer held on to the past. He avoided thinking about the words spoken, the final gestures. He didn't want to dwell. He had accepted what was impossible to change. And, more than that, he now understood that some endings, however painful, were necessary for something more true to emerge. He began to allow himself to live again. Not in haste, but with clarity. Not in search of replacements, but of peace. It was late one afternoon that he met Julia, at a cultural event organized by a friend. She was an architect, discreet, soft-spoken, and intelligent. She wasn't exuberant or imposing. She had an unforced calm, a presence that didn't seek to prove anything. At first, they talked about art, travel, and the kind of music they each liked to listen to on cloudy days. Nothing intense, nothing forced. But there was something genuine there. Daniel realized he didn't need to feign lightness or hide the shadows of what he'd experienced. Julia didn't ask too many questions, didn't intrude, just listened attentively when he said he was starting over. She didn't offer to fill in any gaps. She simply walked alongside, without asking anything. Their encounters became more frequent. Coffees during the week, walks in the late afternoons, conversations that lasted longer than planned. Julia had the rare ability to make silence comfortable. And Daniel, little by little, found himself surprised by his own smile. He was no longer a broken man. He was someone in the process of rebuilding, now accompanied by someone who patiently respected each brick laid. With Julia, there was no rush to label, to give oneself completely. There was time. There was care. There was room to breathe. It was different, and it was good. One Saturday, they were walking through an open-air market. The sun was already beginning to set, and the smell of fresh bread mingled with the sound of a jazz band playing on a street corner. Julia was beside him, laughing at something a vendor had said. Daniel held a bag of fruit and an old book he had stumbled upon. Everything was in its place, until a shadow from the past crossed the present unexpectedly. As he turned a corner, almost in front of the flower stand, Daniel saw Helena. Alone, with her hair tied back awkwardly, wearing a light dress, her eyes fixed on a flower she was holding. The encounter was inevitable. She saw him. And for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Helena didn't react immediately. It took her eyes a moment to process what they saw, Daniel, smiling slightly, accompanied by another woman. The expression on his face wasn't one of surprise or tension. It was serenity. She, on the other hand, froze. Her chest tightened, her hands trembled. Not out of jealousy. Not possessiveness. But because she realized he was truly in a different phase. That he had moved on. And that the image of peace she was trying to achieve was now before her, but in another woman. Julia, unsure of who she was, simply greeted him politely. Helena, unable to feign naturalness, responded with a slight nod and looked away. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach, but he stood his ground. There was nothing more to be resolved here. At least, that's what he thought. But the next day, Helena sought him out. She appeared once more. This time, not with tears or promises. Just with red eyes and a resigned expression. She said she didn't want to disturb him, but that she needed to deliver something. Daniel hesitantly opened the door. She took a small wooden box from her bag. She handed it over silently. She said she expected no forgiveness, no return. That this was just the end of what she still needed to complete. He opened the box right then and there. Inside were old notes, small objects, photos of the two of them, and a letter. Helena asked him to read it alone. And she left. Hours later, he sat in his office, opened the letter, and read it. It was a confession. A confession. An apology without the hope of a new beginning. Helena spoke of everything she had lost, everything she had taken for granted, and the price she now carried. But at the end of the letter, there was something more. A detail Daniel hadn't expected. A secret she had kept hidden until then, the real reason that made her run into the other man's arms, without hesitation. Helena confessed that, weeks before the betrayal, she had discovered that Daniel was about to be promoted to an international position. That I would have to move abroad, perhaps for years. She learned this from a colleague at the company before he even had a chance to tell her. And in that moment, instead of talking, understanding, supporting, she felt excluded, secondary. She said the fear of losing control, of being left behind, of having no choice, made her sabotage herself. He said he didn't seek the other man out of love. You sought affirmation. For anticipated revenge. You wanted to feel desired, important, before being left. And, without realizing it, she was the one who left first. Daniel closed his eyes as he read it. The pain returned with a vengeance. Not from the betrayal itself, but from the cowardice of his silence. If she had said something, if she had trusted him, perhaps everything would have been different. But she preferred to imagine, fear, and act on hypotheticals. The man she thought would leave, had never intended to leave without her. The promotion had been rejected. For her sake. Because he couldn't imagine starting a new life elsewhere without his partner. But she never knew that. The next morning, Daniel decided not to reply to the letter. Not out of contempt. But because there was nothing more to say. Helena had made her choice. And now, even though she regretted it, there was no going back. The love they once shared had transformed into something unrecognizable. All that remained was respect, and perhaps, at some distant point in time, longing for something that could have been. With Julia, he continued. Not in a rush, but with truth. Not to forget, but to begin again with awareness. She listened to him unhurriedly, without judgment. And he, little by little, learned to love in a new way. A love without residue. Without ghosts. Without comparisons. A pure love. And Helena, well, she was left. Alone. But more than that, she was left with the realization that what she destroyed wasn't just a relationship. It was an entire story. A life built together, a possible future, a love that, despite everything, still existed until the last second before the embrace of another's chest. She began to carry the weight of having broken something that was rare. And that weight, no one else could take away. But deep down, there was a lesson. Not just for her, nor for him. But for anyone who has ever considered abandoning a true love out of impulse, out of fear, out of an unspoken doubt. Because when the wrong choice is made, there isn't always time to go back. And sometimes, when we realize the value of what we had, is exactly when we've already become part of what was lost forever. On that cloudy morning, the city's sound seemed muffled, as if even the noises had learned to respect the silence that existed within Daniel. After reading Helena's letter and absorbing the confession she'd so long postponed, time seemed to stretch out, dense and introspective. He walked around the house with a strange tranquility. There was no anger, no exposed hurt, no desire for confrontation. What existed now was a kind of inevitable clarity, the painful lucidity of someone who understood too late that pain comes not only from the act itself, but from the meaning it carries. Love, however strong, did not survive omission, and betrayal, in this case, had not been born of forbidden desire, but of a cowardly choice. And that hurt more. Knowing that the destruction came not from chance, but from the inability to face one's own fears honestly. While organizing some books on the shelf, he found an old notebook filled with notes from the time he and Helena were planning to move cities together, early in their marriage. They were lists of possible destinations, courses they wanted to take, plans to open a small business. He read those scribbles as if observing the distant past of two people who seemed so different, so naive, so certain that love was enough. He leafed through page after page as if searching for some clue, something that had slipped through, some crack before time that could explain what had happened. But all he found was a reflection of good, untouched times, now belonging to a place he no longer lived. He closed the notebook carefully, as if ending a phase with respect but without attachment. On the other side, Helena seemed to be undergoing a slow process of disintegration. She tried to reclaim her life, fill in the gaps, reorganize her steps, but a constant absence followed her like a shadow. She tried to reconnect with friends, resume old hobbies, even force herself to meet new people, but nothing seemed to fit. Everything that had once been familiar now seemed strange. It was as if life around her had lost its luster. She knew it wasn't just loneliness. It was guilt. Real regret. Not the performative kind, full of justifications, but the kind that corrodes silently, making you look in the mirror in shame for your choice. She began to avoid places where she might encounter faces from the past, especially Daniel. The sight of him beside another woman, smiling effortlessly, was a memory that returned frequently and became a perpetually throbbing wound. It wasn't jealousy. It was the pain of realizing that he had, in fact, freed himself. That his love was no longer available. That she had been forgotten, and that it was deserved. Daniel, for his part, continued to gently allow Julia to be a part of his reconstruction. He no longer avoided showing affection. He spoke openly about what he believed, what he feared, what he hoped for. At times, he still carried remnants of insecurity, emotional scars that surfaced without warning, especially when he realized how deeply involved he was once again. But he didn't allow the fear of being hurt to stop him from living. He had learned that loving also means taking risks. But this time, he did so with more maturity, with his eyes wide open and his heart unhurried. Julia didn't ask questions about the past, just listened when he felt the need to speak. And with that, he was conquering a real space, not as a replacement, but as a presence. As a new story. The moral dilemma growing within him wasn't just about the betrayal itself, but the realization that, no matter how much one desires emotional justice, it doesn't always come with the punishment of the wrongdoer. Sometimes, the only justice is a new beginning. It's the silence of the betrayed blossoming into a new life, while the other remains trapped by the weight of their own choices. Daniel didn't want Helena's suffering. But, contradictory as it was, he also couldn't feel compassion. It was as if a part of him had died along with the love he felt for her, and there were no more traces of connection, only dry memories of something that had once been whole. And this left him uneasy. Was it possible to love someone deeply and then simply feel nothing anymore? Was it possible to forgive and still not desire any kind of reconnection? The fact that he didn't hate her made him question whether forgiveness had been enough, but the fact that he didn't miss her at all told him that love no longer lived there. One day, while walking in the park with Julia, she asked him if he believed time healed everything. Daniel was silent for a few seconds. He said no. That time only gives perspective, but what heals is the choice to not dwell on what hurts. And that he chose to stop dwelling on the past the day he realized he could be happy again, even after being shattered. Julia smiled, saying nothing, but holding his hand tightly. And in that simple gesture, there was more affection than 1,000 words could contain. Meanwhile, Helena was making the decision to return to therapy. She knew she couldn't deal with what she was feeling alone. She needed to understand why she acted the way she did, why she chose to hurt someone who gave her everything. She began writing unsent letters as a way to purge her guilt. In one, she wrote that the most serious betrayal wasn't against Daniel, but against herself. Because, deep down, she knew his value, and yet she chose to give it up. She believed she would be desired by someone who could offer her nothing. He traded mature love for an illusion of control. And now, all she had left was the lesson, painful but necessary, that some losses are forever. On social media, she still saw photos of Daniel and Julia. She never liked them, never commented, but she looked. And each image brought a mixture of pain and acceptance. He seemed at peace. And, strangely, that helped her too. Knowing he was okay, that he had overcome, was somehow liberating too. Because deep down, even amidst the rubble, she wanted him to be happy. Because that was the greatest punishment for those who hurt him, seeing him flourish even after everything. One late afternoon, while visiting an antique bookstore, Daniel found a book Helena used to read early in their relationship. He flipped through a few pages, and for a moment, a sweet memory flashed through him. A trip they'd taken, a silly argument they'd ended laughing at, a rainy night they'd cuddled together watching old movies. There was no pain. Only nostalgia. He put the book back on the shelf and left. He'd understood that memories didn't need to be denied, but neither should they be harbored. What's gone is gone. And there, with the quiet sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, he sealed another cycle. That same week, Helena wrote her last letter. This time, she didn't keep it. She left it in the mailbox of Daniel's old apartment, with no recipient, no sender. Just sincere, hopeless words. It was her way of concluding everything. Of letting the past rest. And moving on with what she could still build from what remained. She didn't know if he would read it. But that didn't matter. The important thing was that, finally, she had stopped trying to fix what she had destroyed and started looking within. Perhaps, one day, she too could allow herself a fresh start. On this side, Daniel was already preparing a trip with Julia. Something simple, just the two of them. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He just wanted to live lightly. To know that even after experiencing the worst side of love, he was still capable of feeling the best. His heart now beat calmly. And even though it still bore scars, they no longer hurt. They simply reminded him that he had survived. And then, somewhere between yesterday and now, all roads finally began to point to the same destination. The final choice. The final word. And finally, resolution. 2 months had passed since Daniel had last heard from Helena. The letter she'd left in his mailbox had sat there for 3 days before he opened it, not out of carelessness, but because he knew that by reading it, he would be finishing something definitively. When he finally did, he read each line with the serenity of someone who no longer expected to be surprised. The content contained nothing new, no additional apology, no plea to return. It was simply a kind of emotional farewell. Helena acknowledged that she had destroyed something she would never have again and said she painfully accepted the consequences of her choice. Daniel carefully folded the paper and placed it inside a random book on the shelf, unnamed, undated, as if he were stacking the last brick of a wall that would never be torn down again. Life with Julia continued beautifully, but without exaggeration. They weren't in a rush to label anything, nor did they live under the pressure of an idealized love. They were together because they wanted to be, and each encounter was a conscious choice, not an addiction. There was respect for each other's silences, room for individuality, and, at the same time, a growing connection. Daniel still had moments of introspection, especially when something reminded him of fragments of the past, but now this didn't destabilize him. It simply made him reflect. The maturity that had emerged after the emotional wreckage with Helena was now his ally. It was no longer about fearing being betrayed again, but about understanding that love is trust, even with the visible scars. One night, during dinner at a mutual friend's house, Daniel and Julia engaged in a conversation about choices. The topic came up spontaneously, amid glasses of wine and funny souvenirs. One of the guests commented on how she made decisions that distanced her from someone important and never had the chance to explain herself again. Daniel listened silently. When asked about any choices he regretted, he took a deep breath and calmly replied that regret only makes sense when you still long to return. That sometimes, you need to understand that it's not the pain of loss that corrodes, but the illusion that you could have avoided it all. He said he'd learned that certain choices are final not because they're punishments, but because they simply no longer fit who we become afterward. Julia listened attentively, holding his hand lightly, and in that silent gesture there was more understanding than any other comment that night. Meanwhile, Helena had moved to a new neighborhood. She needed fresh air, new paths, streets she didn't yet have stories to remember. Her old apartment had become too small for the pain she carried. In her new neighborhood, she tried to slowly rebuild herself, immersed in reading and regular therapy sessions. Her psychologist, a straightforward woman, had told her in one of her first sessions that mourning a bad choice is one of the longest anyone can face. And Helena understood this firsthand. Daniel's silence, his steadfast absence, was the cruelest and, at the same time, the most necessary reminder of what she had lost. Some nights, she cried silently, not out of longing for specific moments, but from the weight of having been the author of the tragedy that imploded her story. She missed the life she had, the love she hadn't known how to nurture, the security of knowing she was loved without having to earn it every day. One day, after leaving therapy, she found a corner bookstore that vaguely resembled the one she used to frequent with Daniel. She entered without thinking, walking between the shelves, touching books with her fingertips as if touching memories. She stopped in front of an old edition of poetry he used to quote. She smiled, but the smile faded at the corner of her mouth. She didn't buy the book. She left it there, as if acknowledging that those days were gone. On her way out, she saw a couple in their 30s, embracing, laughing at something they had read together. For a moment, her chest tightened. It wasn't envy. It was longing for the lightness. For the time when she still believed that love could endure everything, including her own neglect. Weeks later, Daniel received an invitation to speak at an event on strategic planning. He accepted. It was something he loved doing, and an opportunity to reconnect with people from the industry with whom he had lost touch. The event was taking place at a cultural center. Julia decided to accompany him. She enjoyed seeing him in that role of reference, and always said it was beautiful to see him in a place where his confidence flowed naturally. In the audience, among attentive and unfamiliar faces, was Helena. Sitting in the back of the auditorium, alone, with a notebook on her lap. It wasn't a coincidence. She had discovered the event by chance, and upon seeing his name on the digital flyer, she decided to go. Not to speak, not to cause a stir. Just to see him, to understand how he was. She needed to see with her own eyes what she already knew in her heart. Daniel didn't see her during the presentation. He spoke fluently, answered questions clearly, and drew sincere applause at the end. Julia stood there, proud, her eyes filled with admiration. When the talk ended, there was a moment of fellowship in the cultural center's lobby. It was there that Helena approached. She waited until everyone had spoken to him, and when it was finally just he and Julia together, she stepped forward. Daniel saw her, and for a moment, everything was suspended. She approached calmly, without any dramatic expression, just a serene look, as if she no longer expects forgiveness but still needs to be seen. Julia watched from afar, respectful but attentive. "I just came to listen," she said, looking him in the eye. "I don't want to get in the way. I didn't come to ask for anything. I just needed to see for myself that you're okay." Daniel stared at her for a long second. There was no bitterness in his gaze, no resentment. Just an old weariness, now soothed. "And did you see what you wanted to see?" he asked in a firm voice. Helena nodded slowly. "I saw more than I expected. And that, it calms me, in a strange way. Thank you for surviving me." Daniel took a deep breath, as if releasing something he didn't even know he was still carrying. "We all survive someone," he replied. "The difference is what we do afterward." She smiled faintly, her eyes welling up. "It took me a while to understand. But now I know. And if you ever remember me, let it not be through pain. I was the worst part of your story, but you were the best part of mine." He said nothing. He just looked. Then, with a slight nod, he signaled that she could go. Helena understood. This was the end, but not with rancor. It was the end with dignity. She walked away. Julia approached slowly. He held her hand firmly, as if reaffirming a choice. And in that touch, he sealed the certainty that the story he was living now didn't need to compete with any previous one. It was a new page, written with clean ink, without erasures. And outside, as she walked down the silent sidewalk, Helena felt, for the first time in a long time, a strange kind of peace. She knew she would be alone for a while yet, perhaps a long time. But now, at least, she had stopped circling her own regret. And this, though still painful, was the beginning of something resembling a new beginning. And somewhere, time kept turning, with its lessons engraved in the choices that cannot be undone. 6 months after that encounter at the cultural center, Daniel's life was already moving at a completely different pace. He and Julia had rented a small house on the outskirts of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by ancient trees and corner cafes that seemed straight out of a storybook. The move wasn't rushed or the result of sudden excitement. It was a daily process of building affection and trust. Their coexistence flowed naturally. There was no need to fill silences or fear of touching wounds. Conversations arose spontaneously, decisions were shared lightly, and, above all, there was absolute respect for each other's individuality. Julia never wanted to compete with ghosts, and Daniel never tried to mold her based on old memories. It was a mature relationship, based on truth and the daily choice to walk together. And he was surprised by his own peace. A peace that wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. He finally understood that love, when true, doesn't require extreme proof. It just is. It exists in the way you are seen, respected, and listened to. It was there in Julia's eyes when she watched him make coffee in the morning, or in the way she snuggled up next to him to read, as if that simple gesture said, "I am here, no promises or spectacle needed." Daniel was resuming projects he'd shelved. He started writing again, running in the late afternoons, visiting places he'd previously avoided. He no longer feared being seen with someone. He no longer carried the shame of having been betrayed, nor the burden of needing to prove he was okay. He was okay. Whole. Healed. And that didn't mean forgetting everything, but accepting it. The past was a part of him, but it no longer defined his path. And looking back, I didn't just see pain. I saw learning, growth, and the certainty that some losses are deliverances that life grants, even if wrapped in suffering. Meanwhile, Helena was going through a much longer and quieter internal process. After the reunion, she decided to completely cut off any attempt to get closer to Daniel. Not out of pride, but out of respect. Respect for him and what he had built. She knew there was no longer room for her in that narrative, and that continuing to force her presence would be invading territory that no longer belonged to her. Work had become a refuge, but not in the sense of escape. She was trying to rediscover some sense of purpose within her profession. She began giving lectures on strategic branding mistakes and, little by little, began to include in her speeches the importance of acknowledging flaws without trying to erase them. It was subtle, but it was there, the mark of what she had experienced. Some friends naturally drifted away, others remained at a respectful distance. She learned to live with it. She was no longer surprised by sidelong glances or the indifference that had once hurt her. She understood that it was all part of a cycle of consequences she herself had set in motion. There were no absolute villains, but choices, and choices always exact a price. On Friday nights, she would often come home early. She would make tea and read something light, unhurried. In those moments, she allowed herself to miss something. But not the relationship itself. She missed the version of herself that existed when she still knew how to love without destroying. There was something irreversible in the way she lost Daniel. Something that no amount of words, gestures, or time could repair. It was like a cup that, even glued together, would never be secure again. She didn't want to get back together. Nor did she expect to. But silently, she apologized to herself for having been so blind. And perhaps this was the beginning of a new kind of redemption, the kind that arises when we stop blaming others and look in the mirror without looking away. On a random Sunday, Daniel and Julia welcomed friends for lunch at their home. Laughter filled the backyard, children ran between chairs, the smell of roast meat mingled with the sound of light music in the background. Julia laughed at a story told by one of the guests, and Daniel watched from afar. There was a sparkle in his eyes. But it wasn't euphoria. It was gratitude. For the chance to start over. For life having reorganized itself, even after being violently dismantled. For the courage to not remain trapped by what had hurt him. That afternoon, as they were cleaning up the dishes together, she asked if he still thought about everything he'd experienced. He replied that sometimes, yes. But now, as he remembered, what came to mind was more respect for the journey than pain for the loss. And he added, with a slight smile, "Today I understand that some falls are invitations to soar." That same day, Helena was walking alone through a neighborhood market. She passed a stand selling old vinyl records and stopped in front of a familiar cover. It was a record she used to play on the nights she and Daniel cooked together. She stood there for a while, staring at it, without picking it up. A woman nearby commented something about the artist, and Helena just smiled kindly. She continued on her way without buying anything. But something in her step seemed lighter. It wasn't happiness, but perhaps acceptance. And sometimes, that's the most we can achieve after losing everything. Each of them met an end that wasn't exactly what they'd initially imagined. But it was a true end. Coherent. Sincere. Daniel had the chance to rebuild his life with a love that didn't require resistance, but rather presence. Julia found someone who knew how to value silence as much as companionship. And Helena faced herself until the weight of her guilt no longer paralyzed her. She didn't redeem herself in the eyes of others, but she began to rebuild some dignity within. And that, while far from ideal, was already a lot. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. Your opinion is important and helps the channel continue to bring you intense stories like this. And of course, if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week we have a new story that will move you. This story offers a clear lesson: betrayal isn't just a momentary mistake. It's a choice with profound consequences. It destroys bonds, disrupts homes, and breaks ties that took years to form. And even if forgiveness exists, what's broken can't always be rebuilt. It's a reminder that love requires courage. The courage to stay, to be honest, to face crises without seeking easy solutions. That in the end, those who betray don't just hurt the other person, they hurt themselves, and often, they lose what can never be recovered. This channel does not and will never support any kind of cheating. Here, we tell stories to show consequences, not to justify mistakes. Until the next story.